The Legend of Zelda, arguably Nintendo's best video game series. Every game you play as the main hero Link in his floppy green hat and green tunic. Sometimes he's a little kid, sometimes he's a fully grown adult, and in some cases even both. Every game you travel across the land of Hyrule, or a place similar, battling evil monsters and magic in your quest to save the world. Not to mention you've got to stop the evil Lord Ganondorf, or someone like him, from taking it over. Then you've also got to go find the Princess Zelda who's gone missing, and let's not forget that giant glowing triangle destined to save the universe. It's a bit confusing. But what a large amount of games we now have. Every game very different and every game very similar, but they always give a unique experience, whether it be through the playstyle, the graphical interpretation, or things like that. Sometimes the graphics are dark and gloomy, sometimes they're really bright and colourful, with an ocean breeze to match. Not to mention, have they improved over the years? Yes, of course they have. And with a new game just on the way, I reckon it's time we look at what is arguably the most favourite Legend of Zelda game. We're going to look at The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. That's how Ocarina of Time was presented to us upon completion. But the musical time travel extravaganza wasn't originally like that. Oh no, the epic adventure was originally far different. The first glimpse we ever got of Zelda 64, and indeed the first 3D Zelda, was at Space World in 1995 when the Nintendo 64 was shown to the world. Now, it was very primitive and was using a heavily modified Mario engine, and if it's just me, doesn't he look a bit too worrying like this?
Well, excuse me, princess.
Quiet, you. Anyway, the game had been to take shape a year later, and we got another trailer, this time looking a lot different. Link looks far more like his Ocarina of Time self, and what's more, the Triforce was clearly seen obtainable, something not in the final game. Link's character model was obviously the focus for quite a large amount of time during this period, with a variety of expressions as seen in these screenshots. The world, however, not so much. It was still very primitive and very blocky, as can be seen in the city behind you. The control scheme, though, was also a large focus. Originally we had an A-B system, much like Zelda 1 or A Link to the Past. Pressing both A and B would allow Link to equip his bow, as can be seen in this early screenshot where he's fighting an extremely primitive foe. It seems that Bow did not have first-person view or lock-on, despite Navi already being in the game. Another callback to earlier games was the dungeon layouts. They were very much like Zelda 1 with room after room and winding corridors, unlike the game's final dungeons which are more themed based. Towns had also started to be developed, looking very Super Mario 64. They're extremely empty with only a few people inside it. And is that the Temple of Time that could be in the background? Well, actually no. Story had barely begun to be conceived yet, but that doesn't mean there wasn't any story at all. Now, other character models were still extremely basic, as we can see in these very, very early Star Fox models. However, it doesn't mean that all models were useless. There's one inhabitant of Castletown, known as Aria. She later appears at Lake Hylia. We believe that she was story-based and used to guide Link throughout the game, much as Navi and Sheik do in the finished product. Also, I don't suppose you recognise where Link is standing. That's right, it's the Lakeside Laboratory from the finished game, or at least a very early version. We can also see an early Dugongo's Cavern. We can also see an early Goron City entrance. We can also see an extremely early Lost Woods. And although you will not recognise this room from the game at all, the data for this room actually still exists within the cartridge. Now that we've seen some stuff that managed to survive this era into the finished product, let's look at some of the stuff that didn't. like this metallic knight enemy who was cut from the game. A shield counter that seemed to be on the B button as an item. Link at one point had a jump before auto jump was added to the game. At one point, Octoroks from the original Zelda and Link to the Past were going to make an appearance. Blood was going to be in the game, and probably the most striking, at one point it seems as if a first person mode was being considered. Possibly the most interesting, however, is the amount of Ganon's castle prototype we see here. We know from a recent Iwata Asked interview with Miyamoto and crew that originally they were worried about the size of the game, and it was going to be structured very similarly to Super Mario 64, set within Ganon's castle with various worlds with Link to go to. You can still see some of Mario 64 remaining in the game, including that door you can see in the background which remains in the finished product, as well as the L is for real plaque which can be found in Dewgongo's cavern. Whilst we're on the subject of gameplay changes, it's important to note that this could have been actually a first-person shooter-style game. At least that's how Miyamoto described it. It also would have been very similar to Zelda 2. You'd walk around in first person, and then when you met an enemy, it would switch to a 2D plane in which Link would fight it. This idea was dropped extremely quickly, pretty much before the game even began. You guys might have also noticed a distinct lack of someone. Whilst there's plenty of this guy, there's been nothing of this guy here. Young Link had not yet been thought of for the game. As I said, the story was still very much in the early stage of development, and thus he simply hadn't been thought of yet. He came in a bit later, and we'll get into that into part 2 when we tackle more about the story. So at this point in game development, young Link's adventures were being taken on by adult Link. Here he's beating up a Kessie, a very primitive early Kessie, but that's besides the point, because he's actually in the very first dungeon we were shown. Dewgongo's cavern. And it looks early. It looks really early. It looks completely different. The textures are different, there's no lava, and possibly worst of all, you have this huge ugly mug waiting to greet you as soon as you get inside. There's also something important I need to mention. Now we don't know when these screenshots were taken, so it's possible that this was still when the game was being developed to be a flagship title for the Nintendo 64 disk drive system. The game back then was going to be huge, far bigger than the Ocarina we have now. It was intended to be Nintendo's biggest project they had ever done. Whilst they still achieved this when they moved it to the cartridge, it was still a lot smaller than it was originally going to be. It lost several features that were originally planned for the game, such as Link's footprints remaining in the sand where he walks, every single crate and pot that you broke remaining broken. You would have a direct effect on the world of Hyrule. Whilst it still hasn't been achieved in the Zelda game, you've got to admit that sounds pretty cool. But then again, Ocarina of Time did pretty well on its own anyway. Well, now that we've seen all the big changes that went through this era of Ocarina of Time's development, you guys can sit back as we look at some of the smaller changes you guys might have missed. Like Link's hair colour, it went from brown to blonde. Along with his shield, that changed significantly too, first starting out rather clunky and ugly, before turning to something which I think almost looks better than the product in the final game. The HUDs changed a lot as well, with the rupees always stuck at 0, 1, 2, 3, despite the fact in the final game you can't get up to a 4-digit number. You'll probably find you couldn't get rupees at this point, and this was just a placeholder. Also notice how the sword was always on the A button. In the game, it's always on the B. And finally, we need to look at Link's shadow, which at this point was far more detailed than the teardrop one which we see in the final game.
Next time.
Well, that's it for this episode of From Concept to Console and part 1 of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Next time we're going to dive into the changing interfaces this game has, the story, find out exactly where young Link has gone, and delve deeper into the myths that people know about this game, such as the Unicorn Fountain. See you guys then.